There is something about being ahead and being chased that can cause us to be inhibited. It's like we've got nothing to face up front that we're targeting. We're out there alone and we're worried, we're concerned. We're looking back and we're concerned about being caught.
It felt like there would be a change at the top of the Premier League this season, and by all accounts, it looked like the Bundesliga would see a different champion for the first time in 11 seasons. However, right near the finish line, though at different distances, Arsenal and Dortmund fell into second. Different circumstances, yes. Arsenal's grip on first was wrestled off over a matter of weeks to the serial-winning Manchester City. Dortmund, they had 4 out of 5 fingers grasping the title going into the final match day, playing in their stadium where they had won 11 matches consecutively, only needing to match Bayern Munich's result, and a series of errors led to them having to scramble from 2-0 down to save a draw, but ultimately fumble the title to the all-conquering Bavarian machine. But that's the thing. In both instances, an opportunity to win and finally beat out the dominant clubs in City and Bayern was there. Their bellies were exposed, so to speak. But in both instances, once again, the opportunity wasn't taken. Why is that? Why is it that despite being ahead in the league, we often see the advantage going to the team that's chasing, despite them being behind still? What's it about being ahead that causes those chasing to often have the momentum? And why do performances tend to drop around the winter for teams that have led the league for so long? Hey, I'm Adrian from Rabona TV. Welcome back to the channel, everyone. And hey, if you're not subscribed, maybe consider doing so as you watch this video. And if you are a subscriber, I have news for you. I'm not a sports psychologist. However, we are very thankful and fortunate to have Dan Abrahams on, who, well, I'll let the man himself tell you his credentials.
For the past 18 years, a sports psychologist, fully qualified and registered here in the UK, but I work globally. I've been lead psychologist for England Rugby and lead psychologist for England Golf. I've worked in soccer fairly extensively across the world. I've worked with about half a dozen Premier League clubs, championship clubs here in England. I've written 4 books. I host a podcast called The Sports Psych Show, so I have my own podcast. Currently, I am the consulting psychologist for Feyenoord, football club in the Netherlands. And they have recently just won the Eredivisie, so they are Dutch champions. I am consulting psychologist to Aston Martin Formula 1, and I am, I suppose, consultant psychologist to a number of individuals and coaches across the globe, across sports.
What a CV. And of course, I really appreciate Dan and the time he took to speak with me. All of his socials are linked below, of course, so do check them out. And by the way, we have to say, Dan doesn't work with these teams mentioned in the video, and he's ethically bound to say that. So with all of this, we're using his years of experience at the top level in his field to formulate an opinion or a hypothesis as to what has been going on mentally with these teams, and try to explain these phenomena in psychological terms for us. Without further ado, let's look at how the time between titles can build debilitating anxiety, the mental gymnastics of chasing a lead versus defending one, why many teams fizzle out toward the end of the season and the best teams less so, and how the narratives that follow these teams become an emotional contagion that affects their performance. And yes, emotional contagion is a term I got from Dan, not from Mourinho, when he called Pogba a virus. Now, I just want to reiterate this. The ways in which both Arsenal and Dortmund eventually relinquished their leads was very different. Arsenal over a course of a few bad results in the last couple of months, and Dortmund right at the death, playing in their fortress, only needing to match Bayern's result after fighting back from being behind. So they are different scenarios. However, what we are examining at a macro level could be considered similar. They've had chances to win the league since the last time they won it, but have failed to take those opportunities for one reason or another. Now, in looking at both Arsenal and Dortmund and how they fumbled the league towards the end, it got me thinking. Both of these sides, when it comes to league titles, haven't won in a while. For Dortmund, they haven't won since the Klopp days, their last Bundesliga title being the 2011-12 campaign. And however many times Bayern stumbled in these past 11 years, Dortmund stumbled more than them. to varying degrees. For Arsenal, well, you have to go back considerably further, all the way back to the 2003-2004 invincible season for the last time that they won the Premier League. Again, they too have had chances since then, but for one reason or another, they've managed to fall short. And so, in my non-professional view of things, Dan, it seems like with teams that are in these sort of situations, there's a fine line between the time without a title being a motivator for them and a source of anxiety that can sort of affect how they play. So what happens here is there's some sort of snowball effect that makes it so that the longer you go without winning something, the harder it can be to get it over the line.
Yeah, I think it's well said. I think there's two sides to the coin, isn't there? There's the motivating factor. We haven't won this for a long time. We yearn to win it again. And as a consequence of not winning it and maybe not putting yourself in those positions regularly, therefore you can experience a greater sense of anxiety as individuals, as teammates, perhaps across the organisation. Maybe, possibly. Ultimately, performance is underpinned multi-dimensionally. I sound like a real psychologist there, don't I? But it really is very much the case. The reality is there's so much noise in these environments.
Noise. What is Dan referring to in this case? It's an all-encompassing word to basically explain how everything is interconnected when it comes to the outcome of the season, the composition of the squad, how injuries will affect the overall performance of the squad, how those players in the squad, based on their previous experiences, can deal with potential losses of form from their teammates, and more, which Dan brings up because
throughout the course of a season, you lose players to injury, maybe at vital times. Maybe you have a makeup of a squad. It very much suits early season form, and then as the season evolves and as fatigue can set in and as niggles and injuries can set in, how big is your squad? What is your squad makeup? So squad makeup is going to make a difference. There are so many things there that are constantly influencing, and I want to get this point across, Adrian, because I don't want to be the psych guy who goes, yeah, it's all psychology. I mean, no, let's stop there. That being said, okay, if a team is experiencing anxiety, does get itself into a position where, oh wow, we could actually win this, we could go on and win this, then it's a real challenge for that team to retain a very strong narrative, a sense of being able to achieve, being able to accomplish, playing on the front foot under pressure, playing with freedom under the burden of pressure of we can go on and win this, playing to win and not playing to not lose. It's very easy for teams, for individuals within teams, to the teams themselves to succumb to that pressure. And as I said, what you tend to find then is a fear.
That could be explained in broad terms, a fear of failure, and that would be enough of an explanation for most to be satisfied with. But fear of failure can take on many faces. Fear of being yet another team that has fallen short and will ensure their club goes another year without a title. Fear of being yet another victim of a serial winning side. Fear of the ridicule that will come from failure. All of this can create an unwanted 26th member of a 25-man squad, anxiety.
Anxiety can cripple individuals and teams. It can limit awareness, damage and or slow anticipation, atrophy decision making, make a difference, a negative difference to physical functioning and coordination. So of course, a team experiencing anxiety, that can have a huge performance influence. They don't find space quickly. They don't see space quickly. They don't make that bit of space in the penalty area. Their challenges are slightly weaker. They perhaps drop a little deeper. All those kinds of factors. Did that happen this season with Arsenal? Did that happen this season? Was it a part of the mix? Did it happen with Dortmund? Was it a part of the mix towards the end with Dortmund? I don't 100% know. I think there was some interesting, when you look at outcomes, there were some interesting results, weren't there? Not least, if we're talking about Arsenal here, the Southampton result would have been one that they would have been very disappointed with. Maybe earlier in the season, a similar game against Southampton would have been won comfortably. Perhaps they were 3-1 up, weren't they, with a couple of minutes to go.
What Dan brought up there regarding Southampton, their first match against Southampton, well, they drew that one as well. Arsenal drew that one as well. But where we're mentioning Southampton often as a specific example, let's swap them with West Ham. Now, when Arsenal was simply focused on executing to their strengths and not worrying about maintaining a league lead or anything early in the season, they beat West Ham. Then later in the season, one of their most crucial matches in the title race was the 2-2 draw with West Ham, of which Arsenal relinquished a 2-2 lead. Of course, that came after they had done the exact same thing against Liverpool, blowing a 2-0 lead to draw 2-2 against another team they had beaten earlier in the season. They beat Liverpool 3-2. Of course, after these two draws, they followed that up with another one with Southampton, as Arsenal had to come back from 3-1 down. So why could they beat Liverpool and West Ham earlier in the season, but they crumbled later on?
Imagine a plank of wood in front of you, sort of, I don't know, a couple of feet wide and about 5 meters long. And if I hoisted that, a couple of feet off the ground, and I said, your job is to get from one end to the other end, you'd do it no problem at all. If I hoist it 1,000 feet in the air, it's the same task, it's just a different environment. You're 1,000 feet in the air, a slip and you're dead. And that sounds extreme, but you could argue, and I ethically have to say I'm not in the Arsenal camp. I've got no idea about their mindset, but whether it's them or whether it's a team in a similar situation, you could imagine, a couple of feet in the air is, Arsenal at the beginning of a season. 1,000 feet in the air may be Arsenal towards the end of the season. So that's a kind of analogy. There's something to lose, and in that case it's your life, for instance. So it really is the same.
I also use the example of Mario Kart and how I used to get performance anxiety when I had a great lead in the race, but I see Waluigi slowly closing that gap in the second and third lap. But Dan's the professional in this department for a reason. Okay, that's very easy to grasp, really. But what about what happens in the mind of not only the people who are witnessing a title race, but for the players themselves? And the specific phenomena I'm referring to here is how we often tend to back those chasing the leader versus backing a leader to hold on to their position. I don't know what it is, but no matter how well a team has played throughout the season, as Arsenal did, as soon as they start to show a crack or a slight loss of form, suddenly everyone was saying how, despite Arsenal still having a lead over City at the time, that City were suddenly the favorites. And to borrow a term from Dan, there's a lot of noise surrounding the shift in opinion, despite Arsenal still leading. Some of that noise? Well, the pedigree of Guardiola and Manchester City, of course. There's a difference between being chased by a Doberman Pinscher or any other spooky dog, that City in this case, versus being chased by a, miniature wiener dog. Forgive me, I'm more of a cat person. But you get my point. There's a bias towards City based on who they are and what they've achieved recently, versus if Arsenal were being chased by, say, Tottenham or something. So there's that noise there as well, on top of the fact that Manchester City have a squad composition that allows them to bring players like Foden, Mahrez, or Julian Alvarez off of the bench later in the season if something isn't working with a previous starter. But beyond that, there's something to explore there. So often we see one team take the lead as Arsenal did, but as soon as we see a dip in form, all of a sudden the sort of mental side of things go, oh no, it's advantage to all the teams that are chasing them, even though they still had maybe a 7 or an 8-point lead at that time. Arsenal and Man City is a great example of this. So Dan, psychologically speaking, how can you explain the difference between hanging on to first or defending your position versus chasing down the leader?
There seems to be this human phenomenon, and I do think it is probably rooted in evolutionary psychology, that when you've got something to defend, then it can turn up the volume of anxiety. as a hypothesis, if you like. I think it's akin to, if we think about a cave family a couple of 100,000 years ago, and back then it would have been the caveman who would have defended his family, who are in the cave, and the saber-toothed tiger comes along. Now, if that caveman was on his own, he might be a little less anxious because there's nothing to defend. Maybe there's a home to defend, but there's not a family to defend. There's things that are less meaningful, not meaningless, but less meaningful. And so subsequently, his decisions, his behavior, everything's a little bit more anxious, a little bit more deliberate. He has to think about it a little bit more. I hope that kind of illustrates the fact that, I would suggest that it's kind of ingrained in us is when we got something to defend, thus stress can build. Anxiety hits us. And I've had numerous conversations over the years with coaches, head coaches, managers, speaking to this, especially around going a goal up. You go a goal up, suddenly I've got something to defend. What can tend to happen is you start to play a little bit on the back foot, a little bit cautious, a little bit hesitant, a little bit inhibited. I actually think that inhibition, that hesitancy, that caution is just something that nobody's completely solved. If we're looking at the micro level of going a goal down, obviously you're looking at the bigger macro level of throughout a season and being in first place and others chasing. But I think they're quite closely related. I'll try not to get too dull and boring here, but there's a 20th century psychologist, an absolute genius, who passed away a couple of decades ago now, called Geoffrey Gray. He was an English psychologist, a polymath, if you like, so an expert in so many different areas. And he was the one who did a lot of the research around this kind of thing, this kind of biological predisposition to experiencing anxiety, especially in stressful situations. And he called it behavioral approach and behavioral inhibition. Behavioral approach, so we approach something, we move towards something, and behavioral inhibition, we move away from something. There is something about being ahead and being chased that can cause us to be inhibited. It's like we've got nothing to face up front that we're targeting. We're out there alone and we're worried, we're concerned, we're looking back and we're concerned about being caught, whereas the people behind, like, well, they almost feel like they've got nothing to lose. We've got to go out full out attack. We've got to go and win here. So there's just something about being in that ahead position that causes people to become slightly inhibited. Again, I'm sure there's psychologists who are far sharper, far brighter than me, who have far more insight into that than I do in general. But certainly this is a phenomenon in sport.
What can clubs do to avoid this? Well, just as managers can create tactical automations on the pitch, patterns of play and passing sequences that they want their players to replicate without having to think too much, you can apply some similar approaches to the psychological side of the game.
There's all kinds of mini processes that you're trying to help coaches create for players and players themselves that they can repeat as they're up front, as they're being caught, so that they stay in that approach behavior, so they don't slip into inhibition. There seems to be something about when you create that narrative of we're ahead, don't make mistakes, don't mess up, don't drop points, that causes them to be inhibited. And so I want to get rid of that narrative. We're ahead, so these are the things we've got to do to stay ahead. Now let's attack those things. Now let's move forward towards those things. Now let's drive into those things. Let's do them better than we've done them all season. It's so simple to talk about, but not easy to do. It's that difference between simple and easy. And it's simple to talk about it here with you, and I get quite passionate about this, but I know the noise at, let's say, a Premier League club or a club in Bundesliga where you've got 25 players with different needs, wants, hopes, doubts, beliefs, temperaments, characteristics, and so on and so on, fears, where the landscape is changing, where you've got different strengths of squads, as we've said, different makeups of squad. So it is noisy.
Let's take this a little further, shall we? Because I don't know about you, but I love this stuff. Okay, so earlier we mentioned how the fear of failure can take on many forms, but What's consistent is how it puts us humans in a fearful state, which affects our decisions and ultimately our performance. And I know it's very easy to forget it sometimes, but yes, football teams are made up of humans. I know, a shocking revelation. Thank you, Adrian, and that insight from your PhD in being obvious as hell. But many of us forget this. So let's jump further into the two different states of mind from those leading the pack and those chasing.
Think about Dortmund and Arsenal being in a threat state. We could win this, but don't lose it, but don't lose it, but don't lose it. What if we lose this? It would be disaster if we lose from here. How silly will we look? And that threat state can come from, here's another dimension for you, a sense of social embarrassment, so much social anxiety. I would argue the vast majority of our anxieties come from what will people think of me? What will people think of us? A social status, if you like, a lessening of your social status. So when somebody's up here and they feel that they can be knocked back, that's when anxiety can arise, a social anxiety. So coming back to the team that is chasing, they have nothing to lose because they're not necessarily expected to win. Nobody's talking about them. They're just talking about the team up front who might lose it from there, or can they push through? Oh, wouldn't it be amazing if that team in second or third place eventually pushed through? There's is seemingly something about there being less pressure on that one. To find a challenge state, that's a challenge state, to limit the chances of being in a threat state. Again, we want to come back to what I spoke earlier about process. Focus on what you want. Focus on the things that are going to continue to retain or develop confidence. And focus on the things that you can control, or at least have a lot of control over. When we focus on those things, we can turn down the volume of stress and anxiety, and it gives us our best chance to hand off, to keep that team chasing us away from us to the very best of our ability.
Would you say that the managers who, there's a lot to it when it comes to, tactics, etc. There's much more moving parts when it comes to success, but the managers who are the most successful, would you say that they tend to find a way to ensure that their team stays in that challenge state and stays out of that threat state as much as possible?
Yeah, look, yes, and I think the brilliant ones do it by design. I think even sometimes those brilliant ones, find it even, they don't even think about this stuff necessarily, but they just, whether they're tactical geniuses, that word is used far too much, but they're tactically brilliant, or, just things come together for them. That's a possibility. Sometimes things just fall into place. You can't deny Pep Guardiola and what he's doing and what he does over the years, or Sir Alex Ferguson over his reign at Manchester United. They were doing things, bringing in the people who helped them find that challenge state, help their team find that challenge state.
Now we're getting close to wrapping up here, but there was one last thing that I had to ask Dan about, given his 18 years of experience in these sorts of environments. Teams that are winning, teams that are close to winning, and teams that have crumbled. Again, with all of the noise that surrounds clubs, from ill-timed injuries, players losing form out of nowhere, to the media and supporter pressure that is placed upon them, they ultimately build up a reputation or expectation that is sometimes unwanted. An example, that Spurs will always lose a final or come second in a two-horse race. With Dortmund, that they will always find a way to be second best to Bayern Munich. Fair or unfair, these narratives exist, and they do indeed permeate the club. So both through action and all of these narratives, you see clubs build up unwanted habits. As an example, I use my own club, Benfica, and how they've built up a self-fulfilling prophecy since the 60s that they will lose every single European final. They've lost 7 European finals since the 1960s, every single one they have competed in. Or look at Barcelona and the habit that they have built up of collapsing in the Champions League. First it was against AS Roma, where they blew a 4-1 lead from the first leg. You could look back to Juve before that. But the following year, a 3-0 lead at home, only to lose 4-0 away to Liverpool. The next year, that unforgettable 8-2 loss against Bayern, etc., etc. As soon as the going gets tough, it's as if their deepest concerns are confirmed, and there's no way to get back from it. So are these habits and reputations playing on the minds of the players? Do they actually have any power over these players? Or are they just something that supporters put more stock in a supernatural way than the players actually do?
What I would say is, when you were speaking, it was making me think of the importance of the narrative of the organisation. Okay, which probably sounds a little bit overly profound and pompous, but go with it, because but there is a degree of simplicity there as well, in as much as when you work in these organisations, which I have done, for 18 years at all levels, including the very highest, there is a narrative that runs through an organisation, and it's an environment, so it's a feeling as well. It's emotional. There's a phenomenon in psychology called emotional contagion. So, which the name suggests what it is. Emotions are contagious, and you do feel it. I've been in clubs that have been relegated, and I've been in clubs that have been promoted, and you do feel it across the organisation, the feeling, and that's often driven by narrative. So, incumbent on a head coach, if you like, is to make sure that he's driving a narrative that helps the emotion of the organization be as stable as is possible. This is leadership. It's got to be as helpful, as energized, as positive, as stable as is possible. That's the privilege and the burden of the head coach. When you have this kind of narrative and all those millions of stories going on every single day that are aligned with those kind of things, resources, strengths, best times, what we want, how we're going to do it, and you have that irrespective of where you are and who you're playing against, then you've got a great chance to manage the emotion of the organisation, which gives you the best chance to behave consistently and subsequently perform consistently. And when you get under pressure, it gives you the best chance to high perform under pressure.
This is exactly what we see from all of the best clubs. This is the difference between those who are serial title winners and those who are inconsistent. Consistency is ultimately what separates the teams that go on a decent unbeaten run at one point in the season from those who go on a multiple-year title-defending run as Man City and Bayern have. So when you take all of this information from Dan Abrahams and you mix it all together, I find that it helps to understand what's happening at teams like Arsenal, Dortmund, Barca in the Champions League, Benfica in European finals, etc. It's all very humanizing. It brings it down to a level where we can all relate. I find that with football clubs and players alike, we forget that ultimately these are humans. They aren't robots. But the best managers, as Dan said, and clubs find ways to help these players focus on what they're good at and avoid all of the rest of the noise, to make their human brain robotic in that sense alone. I want to thank Dan once again for taking the time to speak with me. This has been one of my favorite videos to produce. I love the intersections of football and history, as you guys know, and I have a great interest in the intersection of football and psychology, so perhaps we'll produce a few more videos like this in the future. I already have so many questions I could ask Dan about the psychological practices of specific managers, of different scenarios players face all the time within matches and within a season. I mean, my mind is running. But we'll leave it at that for today. Thanks again for watching, guys. Subscribe if you're new here, and we'll see you in the next video. Ciao.